If you have a true scary story about something that happened while you were home alone, during your childhood, at a carnival, at a mall, in the woods, or anything like that, no reason. Just go ahead and go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to send it my way, if you want to send it my way, of course. And of course, thank you. School was a pretty average thing for me as a kid. I didn't get overly excited to go unless there was a class party or a field trip, but I also didn't hate it. To me, it was just something I knew I had to do, and I did my best at it. I did enjoy bringing home my work to show my parents so I could be praised for it, but again, that was as a young child. I'm talking elementary school. My sister, however, was 2 grades below me, and she loved it. She was always ready and willing to get up in the morning and nearly dragged me to the bus stop with her. We got along quite well, though, and to this day, I would still do anything to protect her or help her, so it wasn't a problem. But when my parents started arguing more, to the point that it would upset my sister Paige, I was happy to get out of the house and go to school. It was a relief at that point. It wasn't every day, but it started getting close to almost every day, so I would get up early so we could leave earlier, even if it meant that we waited outside a little bit longer than normal. School kinda became my escape. I could talk and hang out with my friends. I had to do work, which kept my mind occupied. It honestly started becoming my favorite thing, and weekends were the worst. But during my 3rd grade year, something happened that messed me up mentally, and there is still part of me that has not gotten over it. It started as a normal day. I woke up, checked to make sure Paige was up, and got ready for school. I went to make myself breakfast when my mother made a remark about being low or out of something, which spiraled from there. They started arguing, and it was only a matter of time before it escalated. I grabbed a few packages of Pop-Tarts and waited in my room until Paige came out. Once she was ready, we walked to the stop to start our day. School itself went fine. It was right before recess and I needed to use the restroom. I got the pass from my teacher and walked away. This way I wouldn't have to stop during our break. I spent a little longer at the sink. I remember letting the water run down my hands like a waterfall. I was very young, like I said. I finally came back to reality when I heard the familiar buzz of the intercoms pinging on. The voice told all staff to check their emails, and that this was not a drill. I didn't think too much about it. I just finished washing and drying my hands and walked out of the restroom. But once I was out in the hallway, something felt off. Normally around that time, I might see a different class coming or going from recess, or even another teacher or staff walking the halls. But it was eerily silent and empty. I slowly walked down the hall, keeping my shoulder on the wall. When I reached my class, I tried the door and it was locked. I had to stand on my toes to look in the little window on the door, but from what I could see, the lights were off, and the room looked completely empty. There was normally a bell to tell us when we went to recess, and it never went off. I know that I didn't miss it, so I was confused as to where my class was. I began walking towards the door that we used to go outside, but not only was the door locked, but the playground was also completely empty. So where did my class go? At my age, I began to fear the unreasonable. I figured that maybe they all left and I was forgotten about. Or that maybe I was in the restroom longer than I thought I was, and school was over and I was left behind. I could tell that I was starting to panic and choked back tears, not wanting to cry. The only idea that I had left was to walk to the entrance and see if I could leave. As I got closer, I noticed the lady that was at the front desk was still there. I started walking towards her when she looked over and noticed me. Her eyes were wide and she immediately waved me over to her. She asked me if I was okay and where I had been. I told her what all happened, explaining my exact whereabouts. I also tried asking her where everyone was, but she just asked me to sit in the chair next to her desk. She had called someone on her phone and specifically mentioned, "I have him in the office." She then explained to the other person what I told her, followed by some one-sided response. I was relieved that I wasn't alone, but then I was also still terrified of the situation. Why was my classroom locked and empty? Why was I sitting in the office like I was in trouble? After she ended her call, she did something on her computer and then turned her attention to me. She was very kind and soft-spoken, as she always was. She asked me again if I was okay and if I knew what happened. I shook my head. She asked me if I saw anyone when I looked outside, and I again replied, no. Then she asked if I had seen my sister. I remember feeling ill at the moment. I was just a kid, but my little sister meant the world to me. Did something happen to her? Before I could ask why, she then asked me if there was anything going on at home, and specified scary people showing up or my parents fighting. I confirmed that they had been fighting, but I never saw anyone around that I didn't know, so her questions confused me. I was also confused as to how she would know anything about my parents fighting. She then told me that I would be remaining in the office with her and that my teacher would be bringing me my schoolwork. Again, I was terrified. Had I done something wrong? Was I in trouble? And why did she ask about my parents and sister? I sat at the desk working when I heard the bell finally go off for recess and watched as some classes piled out of the rooms and outside, upset that I was missing out. My class, unfortunately, was around the corner, so I didn't see them. It would be my normal recess time anyways, so I remember spacing out at that point, doodling on some scratch paper. Anything really to just keep my mind occupied, when I started hearing the sound of walkie-talkies going off. 2 cops had entered the office, and the lady greeted them and walked outside the office to speak to them. I knew something bad was happening, and yet I still had no idea how I was involved. Shortly after, the 3 of them came back in the office, as well as the principal, who told me they needed to speak with me and that it was very important. I'm sure that he could tell I was about to cry, but he assured me that I wasn't in any trouble and that my mom was on the way. One of the cops then sat down next to me and asked me a few questions about myself, and then started asking about Paige. They asked me when I last saw her, if there was anything weird or scary going on at home, if I heard or saw anyone different than normal, and so forth. As they asked me these questions, I saw my mom enter the office and she immediately went to hug me. From there, everything seemed to move so fast. The cops asked my mom about my sister as well. They asked her about my dad, suspicious people, fighting at home, and I still did not know what was happening. Once they were done with the questioning, my mom took me home. The car ride was pretty silent, and I was too afraid to ask what was going on. That was until I got home and realized Paige wasn't there. I asked my mom about it, and all she said was that she would be home soon. I could tell by her voice that she did not want me to ask anything else, so I didn't. I just went to play in my room. Except my sister didn't come home that night, nor did my father. In fact, they didn't come home for a few days, and only then did my sister return. Turns out, my sister had been abducted at school, but her abductor was my dad. I remember being so confused and hurt as a child. Apparently, after my parents got into a huge fight, my dad threatened to take us and leave. But he only took my sister. One of the kids saw her reach over the fence for a man who picked her up and walked off. They then went and told the teacher and gave a description of the man. Unfortunately, being a child, he didn't have much of a description, so the adults didn't realize it was our dad. It wasn't until my mom explained very vaguely that it was my father that took her. She didn't really go into detail beyond that. So that left me wondering as to why my dad took Paige only and not me. Why did he choose her? Why would he not even say goodbye to me? I was hurt. I assumed my dad didn't love me and that was it. My mom loved both of us plenty and never made me feel like I was loved less, and I will always thank her for that, but sometimes the thought popped into my head about my dad. I never saw my dad after that. Neither of us did, for that matter. I learned when I got older that he did some time, but after that, we would ask to see him, but he was always too busy, or didn't return our calls. My mom would let us call him ourselves, to show that she wasn't lying. I finally came to the conclusion that if he didn't want to put in the effort to see us, then neither would I, and I stopped trying after I turned 13. But I wanted to share this because that day in school, back in 3rd grade, was one of the scariest days of my life. The feeling of being left behind in school, being secluded in the office with the police, and then once again feeling left behind by my own father, who was also the reason for the school being on lockdown, it's not one that I have ever forgotten. I've always loved writing. Fiction primarily, but I also really enjoyed the research side of things and writing the papers for it. I'm pretty amateur, and can admit that, but I'm always looking for ways to improve. While picking my elective classes in my junior year of high school, one of the choices we had included a creative writing class. I immediately knew that I would be choosing that class, and even my previously favorite elective, which was French, was going to be overshadowed by all its glory. But I was excited. I wanted to improve my writing and even learn more techniques. But while I enjoy using my words to create a place people could get lost in, others use theirs to cause harm, fear even, and not the kind that we enjoy. Not the kind that we're all here for. Our class had more people in it than I expected, and definitely some people were there that I was surprised by. The bigger question was, were they there because they truly wanted to take the class, or because they thought it was going to be an easy one to pass? Either way, I wasn't going to let them distract me from what I wanted out of the curriculum. The teacher was the senior English literature teacher, Ms. Clark, so while I hadn't had her as a teacher yet, I was at least familiar with her, which was nice. I would get to experience her style of teaching a year earlier. I quickly learned that Miss Clark was definitely the teacher for this class, and for anything English and writing. She was very much a Miss Frizzle, but for literature type. She was eccentric, colorful, and very kind. It seemed that she would do anything in class to get the kids motivated and in the right mood, even if it meant making a fool of herself. She stood on a desk before, tapping a rhythm to a poem as she recited it from memory. She was a lot of fun. The class was for the whole year, not just a semester, which was nice too. The goal for the end of the year was to write a short story with a minimum of so many words. Of course, once I learned that, I thought surely this must truly be a group of people that were passionate about writing, because that would be no easy feat, right? Throughout the year, we looked at different topics on how to write a story. I promise this is all related. Some of the sections we talked about were our main plot, ideas, characters, settings, how to show more than tell, and so forth. In the second quarter, one of the topics we worked on were character qualities, strengths and weaknesses, fears, accomplishments, etc. She wanted us to focus on building a dynamic character that was different from our average Daily Joe that we might see. And her way of doing that was to hone in on our fears. Of course, we didn't quite know the full take on this at the time. It started as her explaining how we were going to use a single page and write down all of those qualities. We could be as descriptive as we wanted, and we could write it however we wanted. In lines, number them with pictures, it didn't matter, as long as we thoroughly explained them. The only stipulation, really, was that we had to be able to separate each thought, in the form of being able to cut each of them out. Simple enough. I made my list and thought it was pretty extensive, expecting that we would use these for character development too. We had to do a similar assignment where we wrote down secrets, dreams, and goals. I thought that I saw where this was all going, and I was liking the idea. So, after us writing all of our ideas and cutting them out, Miss Clark came by with a wide and dark-colored basket and told us that we would be putting all of our ideas in the container. Now, of course, this seemed kind of terrifying at first, given what was written on those papers. But we were all instructed to use pencils, and no names were to be written on them anywhere. It was supposed to be completely anonymous. I thought the names weren't provided because we would just be keeping the list to ourselves. I was not expecting that. She explained how our fears and vulnerabilities can be used to make more convincing characters. She was going to read them out loud in front of the class and then pinning them to the sideboard so we could go back to them. The purpose was to give us more conflict options about our characters. We weren't expecting this to bleed into our actual lives. Some that she read were tame, like stresses of passing classes, sadness about a relative passing too soon, or losing weight. But then there were some heavier ones that definitely made the classroom feel different. Someone confessed an eating disorder that they feared would eventually kill them. Someone mentioned drug use, possibly being pregnant, and the mood of the class slowly shifted. We all started looking around to see if we could catch someone's reaction to the confessions. Everyone except Ms. Clark. She would continue with a poker face reading off the slips. Occasionally, she would look over her glasses at the class, but still gave no reaction. She paused when one of them made us chuckle a bit, and she basically scolded us. She reminded us that these were very real. These were very important topics for us, and we were to take them seriously. She wasn't one to get too serious, so when she did, we all pretty much straightened up. But then she trailed off reading one. We knew something was wrong. As mentioned, she collected these from us the day that she read them, so she didn't get a chance to go through them before. I fear that one day I will not be able to handle it anymore, and I'll steal my dad's handgun, bring it to school, and... Ms. Clark stopped reading it, clearly, but it was already out there enough for us to fill in the rest. She quickly looked up and scanned over the room, her face completely pale. She held it up and asked, "Who wrote this?" No one responded. We all looked around hoping someone would confess. I hoped they would stand up and say it was a lie or they were just messing around, but no one did. Miss Clark stood up and gave a small speech. Her voice was almost shaky. She explained how she understood this was a very personal assignment, but that this was more than that. She explained how she appreciated the honesty and true emotions that we chose to share in these, but said this one needed more attention, to be more than a topic for a fictional story. She continued to look us all over slowly, studying our faces, asking one of us to come forward. She even pleaded. If we didn't feel comfortable now, she asked us to approach her after class so they could talk about it more. We sat in silence as she waited for a few minutes, but God, it felt like hours. The room was tense. Some of us were holding back tears. It was insane. I remember sitting there really trying to figure out how much we knew each other. I had a few friends taking the class. 2 of them were in the same hour as myself. My other friends had her in a different hour. However, my class was the first creative writing class that she taught for the day, so I would have to be the one to tell, or rather warn my friends that this was going to happen. So I had a few friends in this class, I was acquainted with others, and there were some others sprinkled in that I hardly knew or rarely talked to. I remember looking them all over thinking if that were true, that confession, who would be capable of something like that? Or who's been having enough issues at school that they would do that? And their plans were obviously more than just self-harm, right? Since they wanted to bring it to school. I had to keep myself calm to not cause anxiety, but that was a hard day. It only seemed to get harder from there. I remember people forming their normal cliques in the halls. Anyone they saw, such as myself, that weren't a part of it, they watched you intently. There was whispering or gossiping, rather. People either kept to themselves or those they knew more, while some tried to make friends and force that connection harder. The rumors spread really fast. It was like they were all trying to figure out who wrote it, or maybe just be on everyone's good side. I don't know which one was better. But then there were other fears and confessions that were shared that day that caused panic and isolation from others. Some people accused others of being the owner of the confessions. The rumors spread about a few girls in that class being pregnant. I was even made fun of because they thought that I had an eating disorder. It was harsh and difficult to see us all crumbling because of one assignment. There were letters sent out to parents about a possible threat, and everyone in my class was required to speak to a counselor. The talks with my parents were just as painful. Overall, the weeks following that class were pretty draining, but the even bigger concern was that no one ever figured out who wrote it. Or at least if anyone did, they were keeping it very quiet. I would like to think that maybe they could have looked at the handwriting and compared it to other work done in the class, but a lot of our work was typed. But maybe they were able to, and they were able to just resolve it. I know that no one was suspended, and no one seemed to be absent from the class, but the effect definitely lingered in the class. Even Ms. Clark seemed different. She did her best to elevate the mood and try to stay in a positive light, but the damage was already done. Ms. Clark wasn't there for my senior year either, and there was no announcement of her leaving, so I wonder if she was actually fired after that year. The class still remained as an elective, but I heard it wasn't nearly as exciting as it once was. All I know is that I learned a lot more in that class than just writing styles, and it left a lasting effect on me. And to my fellow classmates, if those feelings were true, I hope that you got the help that you needed. Over the summer, our high school was going through renovations. They were completely remodeling the oldest part of the building, making some changes to the halls and adding a pool. A lot of us were pretty stoked because adding a pool meant we may have a swim team, and also may have swimming added to our PE classes. And I, for one, quite enjoyed swimming. They had completed the work on the main building, including putting in the pool by the time school started for the year. However, they had not finished the work on the old building. There was a long enclosed overpass that led to the older part of the building, and that part just had classrooms and the normal lockers in the hallway. They moved the anatomy and biology room out of there in order to install more modern supplies like better air vents. Since they had not finished that part of the building, they just had it blocked off with tape and cones. We were not allowed to go over there until it was completed. They even ripped out the lockers, so there was no reason for students to be there. For the first weeks, a lot of us discussed what all they may be doing. I know I've said it before, but most of the school was rebuilt and added on to the original to make it larger. But the West Wing was still the old building, and there was a reason for it. They kept it that way as some sort of where we started versus where we are now type of sentimental element. So they kept the structure. I was curious if they were going to do anything other than repairs. A couple of my friends and I had stayed late at school to have free reign of the pool. We had joined the swim team, so we used it as an excuse to go swimming when at all possible. In between laps, we talked about that old part of the building, and just like that, with eye contact alone, we made plans to go check it out. We got out of the pool, dried off and dressed, and silently waited in the locker room, hoping the janitors and maintenance people might think we already left. They had walked by several times as we swam. I'm sure they were waiting for us to leave too. We gathered our backpacks and walked quietly to the overpass, making sure to not run into anybody. We had to shuffle into a nearby restroom once as we heard someone coming out of a classroom with a cart. We reached the overpass and slowly pushed the doors open just enough for us to shimmy through. They had under construction tape across the doors, so we didn't want to snap it, giving away that someone had entered. Once on the other side, we walked through the sunroom-like overpass and reached the other side where the floor was covered in plastic. I could smell fresh paint, which made sense with what we were seeing. All the doors to the room were propped open or missing altogether. There were some wires hanging down from the ceiling, where they were putting in new lights and intercoms. We pointed out previous rooms we had been in as well as memories from those classes. We took a right, wanting to go into an old room to see if the paper clips we slowly hung from the ceiling were still there. Surprisingly, they were still there. We stayed in the room, talking, reminiscing again, and trying to figure out how to get our paper clips back as our souvenirs. However, while we were talking, my friend Sam stopped mid-sentence, and his eyes were shifting around the room. The rest of us, there were 4 of us total, stopped and looked at him. "Did you guys hear that?" Sam asked us as he continued looking around. I didn't hear anything, and from the looks of my 2 other friends, they hadn't either. He said that it sounded like there was somebody groaning. We all paused and waited, but we didn't hear it, so we immediately started giving Sam a hard time about trying to scare us. But the look on his face told us that he was not playing around. He may have been the type to mess with us, but he could never keep a straight face. We all started walking out of the room when I heard it. There was definitely a groan. We all looked at each other to confirm that we weren't collectively hallucinating. We all wanted to find out what it was, so we headed further down the hall, away from where we had entered. We heard the groan once more, and it was obvious that we were walking towards it. But then we spotted something else. Blood. There was a streak of it along the hall and a small pool of it on the floor. What the hell had happened here? It was supposed to be closed off. Who or what was here? That's when my friend Isaiah tapped out. He said that he didn't want anything to do with it, so he agreed to wait at the entrance for us and headed back. So that left Sam, Keith, and myself to find out what had happened, even though we definitely should have headed back too. As we continued down the hall, we could clearly follow a trail of blood that seemed to stop in front of another room. Sam was getting pretty spooked too, so he said that he would wait in the doorway while we checked it out. I was gripping my phone pretty tight as I was using it as a flashlight, and I started bringing it up so I could prepare to call 911. That's when Keith nudged me and I looked up. The back of the room was lined with all the tables and chairs, and towards the front of the room was a body. It was a man, and from where we were, he looked dead. As we got closer, I knew who it was. It was our previous year's history teacher, Mr. Matheson, and when my light hit his face, he squinted his eyes and groaned again. The noises we were hearing were definitely coming from him, and from the looks of his stomach, so was the blood. We all freaked out. Sam took off. Keith kept asking me what to do, and I called 911. The operator was telling me what to do, and I was trying to explain to Keith what he needed to do. I quickly pulled out a spare shirt that I had in my bag and held it against the wound as instructed. It felt like forever with just the 2 of us. I was hoping that maybe the other 2 ran to get help or something, but they never came back. Luckily, the janitor was still in the building, and they helped the paramedics clear the doorway, and soon we heard wheels rolling and a lot of talking. They had arrived, and I was never more relieved than I was at that moment. They wheeled Mr. Matheson away, and Keith and I walked back to the doors where we entered, where we saw Sam and Isaiah, as well as the janitor and some cops. The cops were immediately suspicious of us and had already detained Sam and Isaiah, but the janitor apparently kept telling them that we were good kids, and they confirmed that we were the ones that had called it in. We had to sit there for a few more hours as we all individually had to tell 2 different cops what happened, what we saw and what we witnessed. Our parents arrived during this, thankfully, but I also don't know whose questioning I was more overwhelmed by. Once all was said and done and the teacher long gone, we were told we could leave with our parents as well. It was hard to sleep that night. It started as such a normal day. We went to swim practice, and instead of just going home or leaving, we decided to go where we shouldn't have. But because of that, we may have saved the teacher's life. I don't know if they did any work overnight, so they may not have found him until the next day. With the amount of blood we found him in, I'm not sure that he would have lived. Then I thought about how it happened. Was it self-inflicted? Did someone do that to him? And then it dawned on me. If someone did do that to him, who was it, and where did they go? How long ago even was it compared to when we found him? We were on the 2nd floor, so it's possible he was still in there, and left using one of the sets of stairs. But what would have happened if they would have seen us? There were 4 of us, so surely we could have taken them down, but we were also still kids. I nearly gave myself a panic attack that night thinking about it. The teachers mentioned it at school the next day, and we all had to go to a school rally thing they held in the gym during big events or news. They didn't give out any names, but they explained what had happened the previous day and asked for anyone with information to come forward. That evening, my mom told me that she had heard about Mr. Matheson's condition. He lost a lot of blood, but he was going to be okay, and he wanted to thank us for saving him. My mom took Keith and I to see him that weekend, and he was seemingly back to how I remembered him, except he was smiling a lot more. He was typically a nice guy, but if you just saw him in passing, you would think he was pretty stern and intimidating. But he was a pretty cool teacher, and seeing him that day just made me think that no matter what, we did the right thing. Oh, and as things started calming down, we learned that Mr. Matheson was not coming back to the school, and the rumors started flying. Kids were talking about how he got fired, but all we were told was that he was moving on. Then they talked about what had happened that day. People were saying that it was a drug deal gone bad, but even after asking my parents about it years later, they claim they have no idea or any additional information about what happened. Hopefully he wasn't involved in anything bad like people were saying. I'm just thankful that we were there to help, and maybe if he was involved in drugs or something worse, just maybe that was what he needed to kick it. So that, my friends, was today's collection of scary school stories. Stories where the terror happens at school. Now, obviously these stories... how do I say this right? These stories had to be handled a bit more delicately than others, potentially with kid gloves, pun not intended, because they can, some school stories can get really, obviously really terrifying. I never intend to do those kinds of stories where things are really, really bad, and you know what I'm talking about whenever I say that, because I don't want to ever be that kind of exploitative person where I exploits, like, traumatic events to make entertainment. I always make comments, like with the stalker stories, that they are edutainment. It is slightly exploitative that I read them, unfortunately, but I also hope that they are educational for anyone out there who needs the education about them, or from them. Same here. I mean, obviously most of my listeners are adults, so there's really no education to be pulled from this, but I don't know, what am I saying? What I'm trying to say is, I don't ever read these in an exploitative manner. Hopefully that comes across correctly. And hopefully you all enjoyed the stories. If you did, please do hit that like button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you are feeling ever so bold, you can go down below the video and leave me a comment with your thoughts, how you're doing, how your day is going, just anything like that. Yeah. If you have a story, just go to what was that inflection there? If you have a story, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to send it my way. If you want, you can join Patreon and memberships, get early access to content like this. There's also Super Thanks, which is a tip to the channel, which is never expected but always appreciated. All that said, my friends, I hope you're all having a gorgeous day. I hope I do see you again here very soon. But until then, remember that you are loved, that you are valid, that you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Do not forget it, and do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.